I inherited my grandfather's house and discovered his dark secret. I was never close to my grandfather. To be honest, most of my childhood passed without him being much of a presence. My mother rarely spoke about her father, and when she did, it was always in half phrases and heavy silences. He's a complicated man, or he has his demons, or simply, don't ask questions. I grew up treating him like a ghost in the family tree, someone I technically belonged to, but didn't really know. So, when I got the phone call telling me that he had passed away, I didn't feel the wave of grief people usually talk about. What I felt was cold, detached, more like the reminder of a fact I had long ignored. That somewhere out there, I had blood ties I didn't fully understand. The funeral was quiet, almost sterile. A handful of distant relatives showed up, faces I didn't recognize, voices I couldn't place. My mother sat stiffly at the front, her eyes glued to the ground as if refusing to look at the coffin. Her face was unreadable, but there was something more than sadness, a strange kind of relief, like a heavy burden had finally slipped off her shoulders. After the ceremony, a man in a dark, perfectly pressed suit approached me. He introduced himself as Mr. Horowitz, my grandfather's lawyer. His tone was formal, rehearsed, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that made me uneasy. "Mr. Kovalenko?" he asked. I nodded. "If you wouldn't mind, I need a few minutes of your time. Your grandfather's will specifically mentions you." That caught me off guard. I followed him into a small back office. My mother came along, though she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The lawyer opened a leather-bound folder, adjusted his glasses, and began to read aloud. "I, Alexander Kovalenko, being of sound mind, do hereby leave my estate and all my property to my grandson, Artem." My chest tightened. To me, why? I barely knew him. I turned to my mother, but her expression was stone. Horowitz continued, "However, this inheritance comes with one condition. Artem must live in the house for exactly 1 year, without leaving it for more than 2 consecutive days. If the condition is broken, the estate will be forfeited to the state." I blinked, trying to process the words. Live in the house? For a whole year? That wasn't a normal condition. That was a trap, or at least it felt like one. I looked at my mother for answers, but she only turned away, her jaw clenched. "Are there any explanations for this condition?" I asked the lawyer, my voice tighter than I expected. Horowitz closed the folder slowly and gave me a thin smile. Mr. Kovalenko was a man who valued discipline. He believed that some lessons could only be learned by staying, not by running. If you choose to accept, you'll inherit a considerable estate. If not, he shrugged. The law is clear. The words hung in the room like smoke. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I'd grown up in a cramped apartment with thin walls and neighbors who argued louder than the TV. The idea of owning a whole house, a real house, was staggering. And not just any house, but his house. The one I'd only heard about in whispers. But the condition gnawed at me. Why would a man I barely knew tie me to his house for a year? Why me, and not my mother, his only child? I asked her on the ride home. Why did he leave it to me? Why not you? She didn't answer at first. She kept her eyes on the road, her hands tightening on the wheel. Finally, she said, "Because he always wanted a second chance. And maybe he thought he could get it through you." Her voice cracked at the end, and she didn't say another word for the rest of the drive. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning. Second chance? A lesson to be learned. My grandfather had lived his life like a locked chest. Now, in death, he had left me the key, but only if I dared to use it. The next morning, I called Horowitz and told him I'd do it. I would move into the house. A week later, I packed my life into 2 suitcases and drove out to the house my grandfather left me. I'd seen pictures of it once, buried in a photo album my mother kept locked away. But the photos hadn't done it justice. The house stood at the edge of a quiet rural town, tall and weathered, its brick walls darkened with age. Ivy crawled up one side, as though nature had been trying for years to take it back. It wasn't enormous, but it had weight. It was the kind of house you didn't just live in, you inherited its history, whether you wanted to or not. I stood in the gravel driveway with the keys in my hand, staring at the front door. For a moment, I hesitated. The silence around the place was heavy, almost accusing. Then I shook it off and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and the faint smell of old wood. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, cutting across furniture draped in white sheets. It was like stepping into a preserved memory. I set my bags down in the hallway and began exploring. The ground floor had a large living room, a dining room with a long oak table, a study filled with towering bookshelves, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms, one of which clearly belonged to my grandfather. That room stopped me in my tracks. The bed was perfectly made, the desk neatly arranged, and the wardrobe closed tight. But what unsettled me was the feeling that the room hadn't been abandoned at all. It was as if he had just stepped out and might return at any moment. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal. I reached for it, my curiosity outweighing my nerves. But when I opened it, I found the pages blank. Every single one. Why would he keep an empty journal on his desk? I set it back down, but unease prickled at the back of my neck. Over the next few days, I settled in. I cleaned, unpacked, and tried to imagine what a year here would feel like. At first, it was almost peaceful. I had space, privacy, and a strange sense of freedom despite the condition tying me to the house. But slowly, small things began to gnaw at me. The first was the basement. The door was locked with a heavy padlock. The key ring Horowitz gave me had keys for every room, but none that fit the basement lock. When I asked him about it over the phone, he just said, "Your grandfather was a private man. Perhaps he didn't want anyone down there." That answer didn't sit well with me. The second thing was the neighbors, or rather, the lack of them. The houses nearby looked occupied, but whenever I walked outside, no one came to greet me. Curtains shifted, silhouettes moved behind windows, but not a single person approached. It was as if I carried some invisible warning sign, "Stay away." The third thing was the journal. One morning, I noticed something on its first page, a faint indentation, as if someone had written there and then torn out the sheet. I tilted the page under the light, and sure enough, I could make out fragments of words impressed into the paper. It looked like a list. Day 1 rules: never. Basement, trust. The rest was too faint to decipher. My skin prickled. Rules? What rules? That night, I dreamt of my grandfather. He was sitting at the desk, hunched over the same journal, writing furiously. When he looked up, his face was shadowed, but I heard him whisper, "Don't make the same mistake I did." I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of those words still ringing in my ears. The next morning, I walked through the house with fresh eyes. Every creak of the floorboards felt heavier. Every closed door felt like a secret. In the kitchen, I found a drawer stuffed with unopened letters, all addressed to my grandfather. No return addresses, just my grandfather's name in scrawled handwriting. I slit one open. Inside was a single sentence. "You know, you can't keep it hidden forever." My stomach dropped. I opened another. This one said, "We'll come for it when the time is right." I tore through the stack, my hands trembling. Every letter was different, but the message was always the same: a warning, a threat, a reminder. Hidden time. What the hell had my grandfather been involved in? I shoved the letters back into the drawer, my heart pounding. For the first time since moving in, the house didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a trap. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the basement door. Whatever secret my grandfather had guarded, whatever he wanted me to discover, by living here for a year, it was down there. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to find it. I couldn't stop thinking about the basement door. Every time I walked past it, the padlock seemed to stare back at me, daring me to try. It wasn't just curiosity. Anymore, it felt like the house itself was pointing me toward it, like everything else was a distraction. One morning, I finally gave in. I drove into town, found a hardware store, and bought a set of heavy-duty lockpicks. The clerk, an older man with a wrinkled face, raised an eyebrow when he rang me up. "Basement door?" he asked casually. I froze. "What?" He shrugged. "Old Kovalenko used to come in here, buy new padlocks every few months. Said he needed to keep something safe. Real safe." My mouth went dry. Did he ever say what it was? The man gave me a long look, then shook his head. "Never." But he looked scared enough that I didn't ask. I paid quickly and left, his words echoing in my mind. Back at the house, I knelt by the basement door and set to work. The lock resisted at first, stiff and stubborn, but after 20 minutes I felt it give way with a sharp click. My pulse spiked. I hesitated, hand hovering over the handle. Then I turned it. The door groaned open, releasing a breath of air so stale and damp it almost knocked me back. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The basement was larger than I expected, stretching deep under the house. Concrete floors, stone walls, shelves lined with old boxes. But it was what stood in the center of the room that made me stop. A heavy iron safe, nearly as tall as me. I stepped closer, brushing off a layer of dust. The safe was old, but sturdy, with a combination dial and a handle that looked like it hadn't been turned in decades. Why would my grandfather need something like this? I circled the basement, searching for clues. Most of the boxes held junk newspapers, broken tools, yellowed receipts. But in one corner, I found another stack of letters, just like the ones in the kitchen drawer. These were different, though. They were unopened, sealed in plain white envelopes. My hands shook as I tore the first one open. Inside was a single line. "The debt is not paid until it is gone." Another, you can't protect him forever. And another, if you don't hand it over, someone else will. I read them one after another, my heart racing. They weren't just threats, they were part of something ongoing, something my grandfather had been caught up in for years. I shoved the letters back into the box and turned to the safe. My fingers brushed the cold steel. Whatever was inside, it was the reason for all of this, the condition in the will, the threats, the isolation. But I didn't know the combination. That night, I tried to sleep, but my mind kept circling back to the safe. I kept hearing the hardware clerk's voice. He looked scared enough that I didn't ask. The next day, I decided to talk to someone in town. Surely someone knew more. I walked to a small cafe near the main square. The waitress, a young woman with sharp eyes, froze when I gave her my name. "You're Kovalenko's grandson," she said flatly. I nodded. Yes, I just moved into his house. Her lips tightened. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "If you're smart, you'll leave." "Why?" I asked. She glanced around the room, as if afraid someone might overhear. "Because people around here remember things. Your grandfather wasn't just some quiet old man. He was keeping something that doesn't belong to him." My chest tightened. What was it? She shook her head. "I don't know. Nobody knows. But there are people who've been waiting a long time to get their hands on it. And if they think you have it..." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. I walked back to the house, her words rattling in my skull. The safe, the letters, the neighbor's silence. It was all connected. That night, I sat in my grandfather's study, staring at the blank journal. The faint impressions on the first page still haunted me. Day 1 rules, never, and basement, and trust. I rubbed a pencil lightly over the page, trying to bring out the faded indentations. More words appeared, faint but legible. "If you're reading this, it means I failed." My stomach dropped. The journal wasn't blank. He had written in it, and then torn the pages out. But why? To hide them? To keep me from finding out too soon? I flipped through the journal desperately. Near the back, I found something, a single sheet that hadn't been ripped out. On it, in my grandfather's neat handwriting, were 3 numbers. 1 for the 7-6. A combination. I felt my pulse quicken. It had to be for the safe. The house was silent as I crept down into the basement. My flashlight beam shook in my trembling hand. I knelt in front of the safe, placed my fingers on the dial and spun it. 14, 27, 6. The dial clicked. I gripped the handle and pulled. The safe groaned, then swung open with a heavy creak. Inside was a metal box, small enough to carry, but heavy when I lifted it. My heart thudded as I set it on the workbench and pried it open. Inside were stacks of documents, photographs, and something wrapped in a black cloth. I reached for it with shaking hands. That was when I heard footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate. Someone else was in the house. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I stared at the black cloth. The footsteps above me had stopped, but the house was no longer mine alone. My pulse raced. Whoever or whatever was up there, they knew I had the box. I hesitated, then pulled the cloth away. Inside was a small, metallic case. Unlike the safe, this one looked new, polished, as if someone had cleaned it yesterday. My fingers fumbled with the latch. Inside were stacks of documents, photographs, and a set of old keys with strange tags. The papers were detailed records, financial transactions, receipts, names. Names of people I'd never heard of, some of whom were crossed out. Photographs showed my grandfather in meetings with men I would now call dangerous. I realized, piece by piece, that he had been involved in something much bigger than a simple inheritance. Then my eyes caught the photographs of people who had written the letters, the same ones that warned him. And at the bottom of one page, a note in my grandfather's handwriting. "Protect it. Do not trust anyone, not even family." My heart pounded. He hadn't been protecting money or property, he had been protecting something else. Something valuable enough that people were still looking for it, even after his death. The sound above me snapped me out of my thoughts. A door creaked, then footsteps on the stairs. I froze, clutching the box, my mind racing through possibilities. A thief, a relative, or someone connected to whatever my grandfather had been hiding. The basement door handle rattled. I ducked behind the safe as the shadow of a figure appeared above the basement steps. A man's silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, moving deliberately. My pulse slammed against my ribs as he descended. His movements careful, practiced. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low but calm. I stepped out, raising my hands, trying to steady my voice. "Who are you? What do you want?" He paused, sizing me up. "I'm someone who's been looking for that for a long time," he said, nodding toward the box. "Your grandfather never handed it over. You just made it easier for me." I clutched the box tighter. "I don't know what this is. I don't want any trouble." He shook his head. "You already have trouble. And if you think you can just walk away with it, you're wrong. I realized then that my grandfather hadn't just left me the house, he had left me a target. And the condition of the will wasn't a trick to keep me in the house for discipline. It was to make sure I didn't leave, to keep the box safe until the right time. I backed toward a corner, trying to buy myself some time. Why my grandfather? Why me? The man's eyes softened slightly. He was smart, too smart for his own good. He saw what was coming, but he underestimated how dangerous it would be. You're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I glanced at the box, the keys, the papers, the photographs. I had to make a choice. I could try to escape with it, but this man was already inside the house, and there might be more. Or I could figure out what exactly my grandfather had been protecting, and why it mattered so much. My hands shook as I opened one of the envelopes inside the box. The contents were documents signed and sealed, proof of transactions that weren't just illegal, but dangerous. My grandfather had been involved in moving assets for people who didn't forgive mistakes, people who didn't hesitate to take what they wanted. I looked up. The man had moved closer, his eyes never leaving mine. That's the truth, he said. Everything your grandfather did, he did to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. And now, it's yours. I swallowed hard. Mine? Yes, he said. You've got the box, which means the responsibility falls on you. And believe me, there are people who won't care if you survive the year or not. They just want what's inside. The weight of the situation pressed down on me. My grandfather's lesson, the year-long condition. It wasn't about discipline. It was a countdown. Every day I stayed in the house, I was learning, preparing, surviving. Every day I left, I risked losing everything and maybe more than just property. I glanced at the keys again. One of them had a tag labeled simply, "Safe Room." I knew what I had to do. The only way to understand the secret to survive the year was to uncover everything my grandfather had hidden. And maybe, just maybe, I could finally complete what he had started. But I had no illusions. The house, the box, the documents, it was only the beginning. And whoever or whatever was out there waiting for me, I knew they wouldn't give up easily. As the man left the basement, he whispered over his shoulder, "Be smart. Trust no one, not even yourself." I closed the safe, my hands trembling, and sat down against the cold stone wall. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a battleground, and I had just been drafted. I didn't know if I could survive the year, but one thing was certain. I couldn't leave. And so my year in the house began not as an heir, not as a grandson, but as a guardian of a secret my grandfather had fought a lifetime to protect. Weeks turned into months. The house became a strange combination of home and prison. I learned its creaks, its shadows, its hidden corners. Every noise outside, every flicker of light in the trees made my heart race. I didn't leave for more than a day at a time, just like the will demanded. The box sat on my desk, a constant reminder. I spent hours poring over the documents, the photographs, the financial records. Slowly, a pattern emerged. My grandfather hadn't been running some petty scheme, he had been protecting lives. The names in the documents weren't criminals, they were whistleblowers, former insiders, witnesses to crimes powerful enough to topple governments. My grandfather had moved them, hidden their assets, and erased their traces. The letters had been from those who wanted access to this protection, network either to exploit it or destroy it. And the keys, they weren't just for the safe. They unlocked rooms in the house I had never dared explore. One was labeled Archives. Inside, I found decades of meticulous planning, hidden accounts, safe houses, and instructions for anyone who might inherit the responsibility. My grandfather had prepared me, step by step, for this moment. The final clue was hidden in plain sight in his study, a letter addressed to me, written in the last weeks of his life. Artem, if you're reading this, it means I have failed to see this through myself. The house, the box, the network, it all falls to you now. Trust no one, not even the letters you find. Protect the secrets, protect the people, and you may survive. Fail, and lives will be lost. Reading it, I finally understood why the will had such a strange condition. The house wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. The year wasn't a test of patience. It was a period of preparation. I realized I was no longer just a grandson. I had become the guardian of everything my grandfather had hidden, everything he had worked for. And that meant I had to be smarter, faster, and more careful than anyone who might come for it. One evening, almost exactly 11 months into my year, someone tried to break in. I heard the familiar creak of the back door, the subtle shuffle of boots on the porch. But I was ready. I activated the hidden alarms my grandfather had installed years ago, the ones I had thought were merely relics of his paranoia. The intruder froze, realized the house was far more prepared than expected, and fled. It was the first time I truly felt in control. My grandfather had given me more than inheritance, he had given me a map, a shield, and a set of tools to survive. But more than that, he had given me trust in my own judgment. The final night approached. I had completed 12 months, surviving threats, uncovering secrets, and learning the full extent of my grandfather's work. I stood at the front door as dawn broke, the house quiet around me, the key to the front gate in my hand. I felt the weight of the past year lift slightly. I could leave now. I had fulfilled the condition. I could take the box, the documents, and the knowledge of the network and walk away. But I didn't. The people my grandfather had protected were still out there. The threats were still out there. And now, the responsibility had passed to me, fully. I locked the doors, walked through the empty hallways, and for the first time felt a strange kinship with the man I had barely known. He had chosen me not because I was ready, but because I had the courage to learn, to endure, and to protect. I placed the box back in the safe, locked it, and left the keys on the desk. Whoever came after me would have to prove they were worthy, just as I had. The year in the house had changed me. I was no longer just Artem, the grandson. I was the guardian, the keeper of secrets, the one who would ensure the network survived. And somewhere deep inside, I knew my grandfather was watching, satisfied that at last, his work had a future. As I stepped outside, the morning sun cutting across the driveway, I realized that surviving the year had not been about wealth or inheritance. It had been about understanding responsibility, courage, and the quiet strength required to protect what others could never imagine. The house stood behind me, quiet and steadfast, and I knew that, in a way, I had finally come home.